Montreal is not a city that, in the public imagination, is immediately associated with the Mafia. Yet between 1954 and 2013, it was one of the most crucial nodes of North American organized crime. Not because of the number of murders fewer than 20 directly attributed to his rule, nor because of spectacular violence or media exposure, but for something far rarer and more lethal, the continuity of power over 3 decades. At the center of this silent system was a man who chose silence as his primary weapon. A man who avoided sensational headlines, but not the thousands of pages of police wiretaps. A Sicilian immigrant who arrived in Canada in 1954 and would become known as Montreal's Teflon Don. His name was Vito Rizzuto. Vito Rizzuto was born on February 21, 1946, in Cattolica Ercole, a small town in the province of Agrigento, Sicily. This detail is not merely biographical. It places his origins in a region where history, poverty, and power have long been intertwined. In the years immediately following World War II, Sicily was marked by devastation and uncertainty. Entire communities struggled to survive, and institutions often lacked the strength to impose order. In this fragile environment, the Mafia did not operate as a shadowy exception to the system. It functioned as part of the system itself. It mediated disputes, controlled access to work, and filled the vacuum left by a weak state. This was the world into which Vito Rizzuto was born, and the world that shaped the values surrounding him from the very beginning. His father, Niccolo Rizzuto, was already involved in local criminal dynamics. His mother, Libertina Mano, was the daughter of Antonio Mano, a recognized local mafia boss. Authority, hierarchy, and discretion were not abstract concepts in the Rizzuto household. They were daily realities. Silence was learned early, not as fear, but as discipline. In 1954, the Rizzuto family emigrated to Canada and settled in Montreal. This move coincided with a broader wave of post-war Italian immigration that reshaped entire neighborhoods of the city. Montreal offered opportunity, distance from old conflicts, and access to a growing Italian-Canadian community that maintained strong cultural ties to its origins. At the same time, Montreal was emerging as a strategic hub in North American organized crime. Its port, its construction boom, and its geographic position between the United States and Europe made it attractive to criminal networks seeking stability and discretion. The city's underworld was not chaotic, but structured and increasingly international. Very little is known about Vito Rizzuto's adolescence, and this absence has long intrigued investigators. There are no stories of youthful excess or reckless violence, no public arrests that mark an early rise. Instead, those who later studied his trajectory describe a young man who observed carefully, spoke little, and learned patiently. By the 1960s and 1970s, organized crime in Montreal was dominated by the Cotroni family, led by Vincenzo Vic Cotroni. On the surface, the structure appeared unified. In reality, it was divided along regional and cultural lines. The Calabrian faction, led by Paolo Violi, held significant influence, while the Sicilian faction, aligned with Niccolo Rizzuto, consolidated its own power quietly. For years, these factions coexisted under a fragile balance. Business continued, disputes were managed, and violence was limited. But beneath that surface, tensions accumulated. Control over territory, access to revenue streams, and leadership succession gradually became sources of conflict. Between 1973 and 1980, this fragile equilibrium collapsed. Montreal entered a period of internal mafia warfare that would redefine its criminal hierarchy. The conflict was not chaotic, it was methodical. Each killing was targeted, calculated, and symbolic. Pietro Sciarra was murdered in 1976. Francesco Violi followed in 1977. In 1978, Paolo Violi himself was assassinated, a moment that sent shockwaves through the underworld. Finally, in 1980, Rocco Violi was killed. With each death, the Calabrian faction weakened, and the balance of power shifted decisively. By the end of the conflict, the outcome was unmistakable. The Sicilian faction had prevailed. From this reorganization emerged what investigators and journalists would increasingly refer to as the Rizzuto Group. Vito Rizzuto did not rise as a visible or theatrical leader. There were no public declarations, no symbolic acts of dominance, no attempt to cultivate a personal legend. According to multiple investigative sources, his leadership style was defined by restraint. Internal disputes were discouraged. Violence was treated as a failure, not a tool. Stability became the primary objective. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Rizzuto Group became the central point of reference for organized crime in Montreal. Its operations expanded across borders, connecting Canada to international trafficking routes. Drug trafficking became a major source of revenue alongside illegal gambling, loan sharking, money laundering, and systematic infiltration of the construction industry. The scale of these activities became evident in 1987 when authorities seized 16 tons of hashish linked to the organization. It was one of the largest drug seizures in Canadian history and a rare moment when the hidden infrastructure of the organization briefly surfaced. Investigators often emphasize Rizzuto's role as a mediator. Rather than pursuing dominance through intimidation, he prioritized agreements. Alliances were forged with biker gangs such as the Hells Angels and with Haitian criminal organizations operating in Montreal. These relationships reduced friction, limited open conflict, and allowed business to continue with minimal disruption. This approach reinforced a perception of order within the city's underworld. Murders became less frequent. Power appeared stable. For law enforcement, this stability made the organization harder to penetrate, not easier. In 1972, Rizzuto was convicted of conspiracy to commit arson related to an insurance fraud scheme involving Rena's Salon in Boucherville. He served approximately 18 months in prison. It would remain one of the very few definitive convictions of his career. Despite years of surveillance and multiple investigations, prosecutors repeatedly failed to secure lasting verdicts. Between 1987 and 1990, two major hashish trials targeted the organization. Both ultimately failed. In some cases, illegal wiretaps involving Rizzuto's lawyers compromised prosecutions. Over time, this pattern contributed to a powerful reputation, that of a man who could not be touched. That perception began to erode in the early 2000s. Attention returned to a crime that had occurred decades earlier. On May 5, 1981, in Brooklyn, three members of the Bonanno crime family, Philip Giacconi, Dominic Trinchera, and Alphonse Indelicato, were assassinated. The three capos' murder had remained unresolved for years, a lingering shadow in Mafia history. When former Bonanno boss Joe Massino and his brother-in-law Salvatore Vitale began cooperating with U.S. authorities, the case was reopened. Their testimony redirected attention toward Montreal. In 2004, Vito Rizzuto was indicted in the United States on charges including racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. After a prolonged legal battle lasting 31 months, he was extradited in 2006. In 2007, he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to conspiracy. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and fined $250,000. Due to time already served in pretrial detention, he ultimately spent about 6 years behind bars. For many observers, the outcome represented delayed justice, arriving 26 years after the crime. While Rizzuto was incarcerated, Montreal changed. His absence created a vacuum that destabilized long-standing arrangements. Between 2009 and 2010, his family was systematically targeted. His son, Niccolo Rizzuto Jr., was murdered in December 2009. His brother-in-law and advisor, Paolo Renda, disappeared in May 2010. In November 2010, his father, Niccolo Rizzuto, was assassinated by a sniper at the age of 86. These acts were widely interpreted as deliberate and strategic, aimed at dismantling the core of Rizzuto power. Analysts pointed to the involvement of the Toronto Ndrangheta, signaling a broader struggle for control beyond Montreal itself. When Vito Rizzuto was released in October 2012 and returned to Canada, the environment he encountered was profoundly altered. Alliances had fractured. New actors had emerged. Violence once contained had resurfaced. In the months that followed, Montreal experienced a renewed wave of murders, including those of Emilio Cordile and Tony DeSalvo. Journalists and investigators speculated about attempts to reassert control, but definitive judicial proof linking each episode directly to Rizzuto never emerged. What was clear was that the era of uninterrupted stability was over. On December 23, 2013, Vito Rizzuto died in Montreal at the age of 67. The official cause was complications from pneumonia, likely connected to lung cancer and delayed oncological treatment. With his death, a unique chapter in the history of Canadian organized crime came to an end. Vito Rizzuto was not the most violent boss, nor the most visible, but he was one of the most effective. His story demonstrates that, in the world of organized crime, control can be more powerful than fear, and silence more dangerous than weapons.